Why am I here? Why am I doing the things that I'm planning to do? Why have I done the things I've done before? It's a real simple question, but that's how I start out at the beginning of my year. Usually, once I answer that question, all the other things kind of fall into place. The how, whens, those kind of things fall into place, but I always start with the why. As in my role as a staff member administrator of Beloit College, it always usually comes down to a real simple answer. My why is the well-being, the success, the caring of the students here on our campus. So when I missed the meeting, and I mean literally missed the meeting, and was named the Title IX coordinator at Beloit College, unfortunately I didn't ask my why. And so what happened is myself and others just got right down into it and started thinking about policy, about compliance. And we just kept thinking about that. And the more we thought about it, we weren't getting anywhere. It was becoming frustrating. We didn't know what we were going to do, okay? And so it started to occur to us that it just wasn't feeling right to be focused on those things. So then I finally decided to ask my why and ask us why. Right away, the answer came to us because what it appeared is that as much as we were talking about policy, and again, policy is important, but more important than policy, things that happen on your campus are harmful, painful, and detrimental, first of all, to our students and to the institution. We needed to go beyond that, okay? We needed to answer our why, and our why far exceeds compliance. Understand, compliance is important, there's no doubt about it, but it's a benchmark. But we had to go beyond a sense of compliance. Okay, because in our work with this, it occurred to us that what's more important to us was the benefit to our students, the needs for their well-being, education of our campus, and also to create an environment where our students could be successful. Now, after thinking about it, thinking back in the past, I'm glad that I missed that meeting. This work is critical to our institutions, not just ours, but others, and to our students. Taking this student-first, proactive, empowering approach, okay, versus a reactive, controlled approach, just feels right. And so when we start to look at how we attract or how we go about doing this, it's important for us to understand that more important than anything is that we treat this as a preventive measure before we can get to policy.
So for me, my why occurred during my junior year, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when I was studying abroad in Copenhagen, Denmark. And in Copenhagen, I was studying gender and sexuality in a Scandinavian context with a specific focus on the industry of sex work. But when I was in Copenhagen, I started hearing this firestorm of media, all these news stories coming out of, back home about FSU and Missoula and all of this sexual violence that was occurring on campuses, on colleges and universities across the United States. So I started to shift my lens. I started to shift this gender and sexuality lens to back home, to this issue of sexual violence in college communities. So I started to ask questions such as, are my students at Beloit College, are my peers, are my friends being affected by the sexual violence that is occurring at campuses, colleges, and universities across the United States? Is Beloit College perhaps maybe different or resistant to this pandemic of sexual violence? And what can I do as a student to address this problem on my campus? So like many other Beloit College students, and you guys in the audience who are students will hopefully connect with this, we learn to focus our passions and our research questions on the communities that we're a part of. And so with this perspective, I started to do my senior thesis research on the intersections between masculinity, sexual assault, and athletics here at Beloit College. My why to take on all of this work wasn't necessarily like Cecil about policy or compliance or these big national issues that were happening. In fact, I was much less interested in why this was happening across the United States, but rather if and why it was happening at my own institution. So then after my senior year, I spent the summer working in the Dean of Students office doing sexual violence prevention programming and working with compliance and policy actually. But even when I got to work with compliance and policy and getting into all of that detail, my why still stayed exactly the same. I was still thinking about the student experience and whether or not our environment at Beloit College was creating some pretty negative experiences for students here.
So when we began to process this, we broke it down into creating a working group which consisted of students, faculty, staff, and administrators. And the idea was to garner input from the entire campus about what were the areas that needed to be addressed in regards to sexual assault, violence, and prevention on our campus. What came out of that were basically 4 main categories and then 2 initiatives that ran through all 4 of those initiatives. First of all, honestly, was policy. And as Caitlin spent probably the entire summer working on this year for us and working through it, but more in terms of accessibility and clarity. People wanted to understand, how can I get to it, and then make sure that it was clear so that I can understand what was in the policy. The next thing that came up was mandatory reporting, which again is just a matter of understanding who is a mandatory reporter, why are there mandatory reporters, and again, there is some skill behind being a reporter and telling people exactly and instructing people on how you need to deal with your students. This was seen more of a support and safety measure for our students. Again, putting students first and understanding we have to provide support for them all the way through the process, even if there's something that does occur on campus. The other thing that came up highly considered was intervention, because we were talking about prevention. So how do we intervene? How do we prevent these things from happening? One of the most highly recommended initiatives around that is bystander intervention. We've created trainings beyond. How do I intervene in a situation? How do I safely intervene in a situation? How do I read a situation? All these things are what the training and the education is about for individuals on our campus. The next thing that came up was consent. Now, for me, I'll be honest with you, when I first started talking about consent, to me it was a policy issue. You know, every institution, every university, every college has in their policies a statement about what consent is. But we started to take a more proactive approach to it, as we did with everything, and say consent can be a useful and powerful tool in prevention. Asking the question, understanding what consent is, can help us in the prevention of a situation that may have started out bad but can turn out to be a positive. And so we started to look about educational means around consent. Now, after going through all that process, of course, now we say, okay, we've got these areas that we need to cover. We understand that we have to create training, we understand we have to create education around it, but how do we get that out to the rest of the campus? How do we ensure that our campus is going to become competent, and our campus is going to become proficient, and they're going to become confident in asserting this throughout the entire campus?
So when I was working in the Dean of Students office this summer, and throughout my entire time working with Cecil and other staff members on preventing sexual violence on our campus, you know, we all shared the same why. And that was really important because that set a foundation for sort of a framework for how we were going to address these issues. It was always about the student experience, always asking ourselves, what can we do that is best for our students? And so sort of when we were going through this work, and looking back on it now, it was definitely an unconscious process, but reflecting upon this, we really found that there was 2 guiding principles to our work, and I'm going to share with those 2 with you guys today. So the first thing, all institutions, all higher education institutions across the United States, including ourselves, really have to know is that sexual violence is an issue on our campus that cannot and should not be hidden. It absolutely cannot be ignored, and we have to openly acknowledge that this is an issue that is happening to our students on our campus. So fortunately, Beloit College has done this. In the past year, as Cecil was mentioning, we had a sexual assault task force whose purpose was to actually initiate a series of campus conversations. So in the past year, we had all these conversations happen. And within these conversations, we got students talking about what the campus climate was like in regards to sexual violence, you know, what the administration was currently doing in response to this, and really, and I think most importantly, what students wanted to see happen in the future. And I was actually at one of these conversations last year, you know, back in one of our student centers, and 30 students sitting around. I thought to myself, I heard this conversation happening, and I thought to myself, you know, this is actually really powerful. The administration, the institution of Beloit is asking us as students what we think, and they want to listen to what we have to say. You know, that set this foundation that we're a community that's addressing this issue. We're not just an administration. We're not just an institution that's separate from its students. We as students are part of the solution to this problem. So the result of these conversations was an agenda, as Cecil mentioned, you know, with increased emphasis on bystander intervention, trainings, and more dialogue and education around consent at Beloit College. And so the second principle I want to share with you guys is that, federal compliance, so compliance with these federal mandates, Title IX, Violence Against Women Act, Clery Act, while all of these mandates are extremely important, and like Cecil said, they're a benchmark, they're not everything about what we're doing to address sexual violence. They're not the beginning and they're not the end. They should not be what we focus on here. And actually, I would make the argument that at Beloit College, we put compliance second. And instead, we actually put our students first. And this actually goes back to our why of what we're doing here, our question of what is best for our students. And so actually, I would make the argument that compliance is an indirect way to solve this problem that we have actually addressed instead by taking a student-centered approach. Unfortunately, we know that sexual assault, sexual violence does occur at our campus, and we know it occurs even if policies and programming are 100% compliant in our institution and in institutions across the country. So what then are we at Beloit College doing differently? What are we doing that's unique, that's possibly more effective? How are we making sure that our students and our staff and our faculty are exposed to the right information and the resources and support that they need to take on the issue of sexual violence?
And I'm just going to talk to you about one of the models we did, again, to make sure that we could communicate what our work was and how we wanted to get this information out to campus, was to create a model similar to a train-the-trainer model, if you will, and we call it a pandemic for reasons you'll understand in a minute. Understand, how do pandemics become pandemics, for example? And so what we chose to do was to take the issues that we were talking about, 3 of the topics we were talking about: mandatory reporting, bystander intervention, and consent. And what we would do is we had a group of individuals that we would line up that were experts in these fields, if you will, and they would create some training mechanisms by which, let's say, for example, we take a structure we have in place here, our RAs, our resident assistants. And what they would do is they would take a group of our resident assistants and they would train them. They would train them around these issues, train them around skills, understanding, and education of these things. And we might take a small group of RAs and train them. Then they would entail training a larger group of our resident assistants, okay? And so they would become more adept in the training and the understanding. Then a larger group. And then that larger group, all of them would go back to their floors and train their students, okay? And train students that are on their floor, and have conversations with them, have discussions with them around sexual assault in these smaller areas, but again, being able to disseminate the information and the ideas behind our idea of prevention of sexual assault and misconduct on our campus. And so it would grow that way. And so let's say if we do some of that with our faculty, staff, administrators, we do some of that in other areas on campus with other leadership groups. So eventually our whole campus has been exposed to and has a sense of what we're talking about around these issues of sexual assault and prevention. Now, the thing of it is, as you think about, there'll be a lot of replication, there'll be a lot of duplication, but when you're talking about competencies, you're talking about skills, you're talking about learned behavior, there's nothing wrong with repetition. As a matter of fact, it's something that you would want, so that people do become more confident at this type of work. And so this is just one of the models that we're talking about using that can help us replicate this and grow in that confidence on our campus to be more active in our sexual assault prevention efforts.
So over the past year, all of the attention that has been paid to sexual violence, specifically on our campus, out of all of this attention, I've seen some pretty incredible stuff happen. The amount of people, or students particularly, who've been engaged and initiated projects out of this attention has been pretty phenomenal. We have our RAs participating in this pandemic train-the-trainer model. We have students who spend an entire extra semester doing research and projects for prevention of sexual assault and supporting survivors of sexual assault. We have our athletic teams actually participating in these bystander intervention training sessions. We have new clubs and organizations being formed, such as the Beloiters Always Ask campaign, which focuses on consent and the importance of consent in prevention of sexual violence. We have our Greek life organizations really stepping up and saying, this is a problem in our community as a Greek community and also within our campus as well, and we want to take steps to address it. And a short story about one of these Greek organizations. So one of our fraternities had an all-male conversation around sexual violence and prevention of sexual assault last year. And the Dean of Students attended this conversation, and 25, 30 guys sitting in the room, and the Dean of Students listening, and she was so inspired by the drive that these young men had and their willingness to engage in this conversation and and their want for more spaces like this and skills and support to address sexual violence, that she's actually now teaching an actual academic course. It's addressing what is a healthy sexuality, what is sex for, how can we prevent sexual violence on our campus and turn our campus culture into to have a more positive sexuality. So with all of these efforts that are happening, none of them, I think, could really be possible without those two principles that I talked about earlier. So one, that open acknowledgement that this issue is happening to our community members, to our students, to our friends, to our peers, and that we have a willingness to focus not on federal compliance, but instead on the student, always asking the why. What are we doing for our students that can make their experience here at Beloit College the best possible and as free from sexual assault?
But our hope is that we've created a model that will provide a framework that's flexible, that's replicable, and also sustainable for our campus as well as many others. Our why will always be student first. And for us, that means way before policy and far beyond compliance.
So all in all, this is an issue that's not just about the administration. It's not an administration issue. It's not just a student issue. This is a campus community issue. All of us, including all first years, all staff members who've been here for 25, 30, 40 years, all of our staff members, all of our faculty, we are all responsible for and part of the solution in addressing sexual violence on our campus. There's many more efforts both on this campus and in colleges and universities across the United States that are effective and really, really good models. And this is a work in progress. This will never be done, unfortunately, but in the spirit of empowerment and thinking back to what we really want you guys to take away from this is that we need to start thinking about this issue from a community standpoint, from a community framework, that we're all in this together, and that in order to make our communities to be healthier and safer and more inclusive and free from sexual violence, we have to start before policy and go beyond compliance. Thank you.